we have touched in very important and how to say characteristic ways on how technology is being utilized in our everyday lives and also within the current and most pressing conflicts in the world today. And over the last two sessions, we have discussed about the important role that technology platforms also hold in these issues and the solutions that we have to procure moving forward. And this session, the last session of the day, session 5, is precisely directed into thinking about how to build systems of accountability. And for that purpose, I am very happy to welcome Mallory. Hola, Mallory. Mallory Knodel is a technologist and feminist advocate that works at the intersection of internet infrastructure, governance, and gender justice. She is currently co-chair of the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group of the Internet Research Task Force. And she leads the work through the Social Web Foundation to advance open, interoperable, and rights-respecting digital systems. Her work across the time has centered feminist approaches of technology for accountability and to examine how platforms and standards can be used to disrupt gender-based harms. Thank you, Mallory, for being with us, and welcome you and the participants of the next session.
Great. Thank you, Lulu. Thank you to APC and to UNFPA. It's really great to be here, especially to be moderating this session, because as you mentioned, this is very much work that I've done. And in, I think, the tradition of feminist strategy, right, there's always we challenge power and we create safe spaces. And so I invite you and welcome you to the Challenging Power session. We're going to be hearing from experts in civil society, from regulators, and from investors, and from all of you. So we have active portions in this session where we're going to invite you to share your experiences, because in this session, we are really getting to the bottom of how we hold technology companies accountable. And there are no wrong answers. There are no bad ideas. Please, we want to just really leverage and collect the knowledge that's in this room today. And I'm really excited to get to our speakers. This session is going to examine the powerful levers, including government regulation at national and regional levels and strategic influence through industry standards and investment, for example. Speakers are going to share their proven strategies and real-world examples of efforts that have successfully transformed platform policies and accountability mechanisms. So we have Luísa Franco Machado from Equilabs, Marina Elefante from the World Bank, and Lyndsey Scott from the regulator in the UK, Ofcom. So really, really pleased to have you with us. I just want to make sure that the audience, you're coming into this as well as experts, and to think about who you are and how you position yourselves relative to power, what strategies you're using. Are you doing survivor advocacy? Are you working in technical standards? Are you doing policy advocacy? Are you a researcher building data science and basically getting ready, getting all the receipts we need, right, to come prepared to challenge power? We want to just really try to visualize this collective power we have right now and your specific position in it. First, I'm going to turn it over to our first intervention from Marina Elefante. Please, Marina, come in. We're going to listen to you talk about the laws and policy, the landscape of laws and policy related to tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And so the question I'm putting to you is, the World Bank's own mapping of TFGBV laws provides a rare bird's eye view of global safety. Please, if you could describe this work, share a bit more about what your research has identified as policy gaps, and what you found as the most effective ways for lawmakers that can take this data, translate it into real requirements that have actual change at the end of them, and how platforms operate within that space. Turning it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon and good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here, such a timely and important event. At the World Bank, through the Women, Business and the Law unit where I work, we provide a global comparable assessment of how laws and policies affect women's economic opportunity across 190 economies. And just last week, we published a new edition of our annual report. And let me tell you, the findings are striking. We find that on average, women hold only 2/3 of the rights enjoyed by men. And that's a significant gap in gender equality under the law. But we know the laws alone are not enough. What we also find is that less than half of the institutions and the policies that will be needed to implement those laws are in place. And the same experts we consult to collect our data report that these laws, when they are in place, are only partially or insufficiently enforced. We measure these across 10 areas of the law affecting women's economic participation, from mobility and workplace protections to pay and parenthood, entrepreneurship and assets, and women's safety. And the weakest performance globally is in the area of women's safety. In this area, we find that barely over 1/3 of the laws that would be needed to protect women from violence are in place. And even when these laws exist, enforcement is perceived as insufficient in 80% of cases. And this is where technology-facilitated gender-based violence also becomes central. Digitalization has introduced new forms of harm that directly affect women's ability to participate in economic life. Digital safety is not a niche issue. It is a precondition for women's economic participation. As professional networking or job searching or entrepreneurship and commercial activity increasingly move online, women face heightened exposure to online harassment, to abuse, stalking, impersonation, and image-based violence. Our Women, Business and the Law 2026 report shows that out of 190 economies examined, 100 still do not have legislation addressing cyber harassment. This is more than half of the world. So what do we see? What gaps do we observe when we map these laws globally? So let me mention 4. Number 1 is legal precision in the digital context. Many countries tell us, well, we have a general harassment provision. But then when we analyze these texts closely, we often find that the law covers, for example, sexual harassment, but not all other behaviors, such as threats or stalking or coercion or economic abuse. Or these laws may apply only in specific contexts, such as employment, but not in public or online spaces. They do not explicitly reference online or technology-facilitated conduct. Or when they do, many times they restrict it to the publication of images, but not necessarily threats to publish or impersonation or deepfake manipulation or persistent digital stalking. This matters. Online violence is qualitatively different from offline violence. A woman can be targeted everywhere online, at work, at home, across jurisdictions, 24 hours a day. This type of harm is scalable, is searchable, is permanent. So broad or ambiguous clauses are not sufficient in a digital ecosystem. Precision in legal drafting determines whether law enforcement can act, whether courts can issue injunctions, whether platforms have a clear compliance obligation. A second gap we observe is the absence of multiple avenues of redress. Some laws only rely on criminal penalties. criminal law is important for deterrence and retribution, but criminal processes are also often slow, intimidating, and they require proof beyond reasonable doubt. So civil remedies such as injunctions or compensation or expedited removal of online content operate under a lower evidentiary threshold and can provide quicker and survivor-centered relief. Across legal systems, ensuring both criminal and civil pathways expands access to justice. It is about increasing access points. Third gap that we observe is about institutional capacity and enforcement. Again, our data show that even when laws exist, enforcement is often weak. It is insufficient because clear institutional mandates, trained law enforcement, monitoring bodies, data collection systems are essential. Without these defined responsibilities, laws remain a mere suggestion. And finally, and coming even more specifically to the point of your question, so how do lawmakers translate data into requirements that actually change platform behavior? We are observing a shift from just defining crimes to also defining platform obligations. This may include the timely removal of illegal or abusive content, accessible reporting mechanisms with defined timelines, restrictions on digital contact, risk assessments for systemic harms. So platforms respond to regulatory clarity. For example, the UK's Online Safety Act has introduced responsibility onto platforms. It requires companies to assess risks, remove illegal abusive content, provide reporting mechanisms, and can impose fines up to 10% of global revenue for non-compliance. So benchmarking data plays a role here as a diagnostic tool. Lawmakers can use it to identify gaps. Do we explicitly recognize online conduct? Do we provide civil remedies? Do we impose defined takedown timelines? Do we require transparency? It becomes a structured checklist for reform. Now, in all of this, of course, the emerging frontier is artificial intelligence, and all these rapid advances, including deepfakes, voice cloning, synthetic media, have intensified risks. These technologies allow the fabrication of non-consensual sexual imagery and defamatory material that can spread virally within minutes. So this raises complex questions from a legal perspective. How do we define harm that is created by an algorithm? How do we assign liability to the individual user, to the platform, to the developer of the model, to all of them? So the central challenge ahead for legislators is for the law to become technologically agile and not obsolete. And I would like to emphasize one last point. All of this matters economically. Technology-facilitated violence is not just a safety issue, and that would be sufficient, to be brought to the attention of legislators. But it is also an economic barrier. If women withdraw from online spaces due to harassment, if they avoid professional networking platforms or digital entrepreneurship, remote work, or online marketplaces, the result is lost productivity, lost income, lost innovation. In that sense, digital safety is foundational to inclusive growth. So for a project like ours at the World Bank Women, Business and the Law, it gives us an opportunity to link digital safety directly to economic participation and development outcomes. So what concerns me the most is the scale and the speed at which digital violence spreads. But what gives me hope is the growing legal momentum that we are seeing across regions. between October 2023 and October 2025, 7 economies across 5 regions have introduced laws addressing cyber harassment, either through criminal penalties or civil remedies. So more governments are recognizing digital violence as real violence, and survivors and civil society are driving reform. So benchmarking here provides evidence to guide legislative drafting and precision. What changes platform behavior is not aspiration. It is clear, enforceable obligations backed by institutional capacity. And this is where comparative data can play a transformative role. It cannot replace political will, but it can sharpen it. So for those interested in exploring the data in more depth, including country-by-country legal texts or reform trends, and all of our safety indicators, I would like to invite you to consult the Women, Business and the Law 2026 report and database at wbl.worldbank.org. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion that follows.
Great. Thank you so much, Marina. It was really interesting to hear what you found through your real research and data gathering. So this is an opportunity for audience interactivity. I'd like to prompt you with the question, what legislative or technical standard opportunities or gaps exist in your region or your nation that could address either, the opportunity is they could address a current safety deficiency in platform design, or it's been proposed, or it's been imposed, but it didn't work. What are some things that everyone could share? And I'm going to look at the chat for your responses. You are also welcome to raise your hand and speak. But before we sort of get into the discussion, I just want to remind everyone that the organizers of this event have very thoughtfully put together guidelines and that includes code of conduct. So we're going to abide by those. And as the moderator, I'll be looking for any issues. And if you experience any issues, at the very end of that document is an email address that you can use to air any concerns or get some help. So with that, we do have a comment from Lena S. I can just read it aloud, but also, Lena, you're welcome to come off of mute. So it says, agree that litigation, regulation, and reputation are the key drivers for platform change, but there can also be voluntary changes by the platforms, which would make it harder for the harm to happen in the first place. And then appears to be a link to prevention by design, a roadmap for tackling TFGBV at the source. I also see Lena, same person, has shared a Substack on tech and social cohesion, intercepting harm. Thank you for that contribution. Reactions to that? Others from the audience who would like to weigh in on this, please do. Okay, Lena, please go ahead, and you should be able to unmute yourself. Sorry, I'm unable to see hands. That's a problem. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this. I just want to acknowledge the incredible work that's being done in highlighting how pervasive this issue is, and the fact that across so many contexts and cultures, we're seeing, a predictably pattern of harm. And that means that the platforms themselves have an opportunity to really be asked, why is it that this TFGBV continues to be a systemic risk? And as you know, many regulatory approaches are looking beyond content moderation and focusing on the systemic risk. And in the EU, in the Digital Services Act, there's an effort, but which can be reinforced, to really demand that there's more attention to why is this predictable harm against women and girls so pervasive. So the prevention by design are examples that even without regulation, that platforms can do, which can make it simply harder for this harm to exist. But I also wanted to say that I know we'll hear from Ofcom in a moment, but they're leading in this space to really try and focus the attention of the systemic harm, including TFGBV. So I'd love to hear more about that. I think that's a real opportunity for leverage and influence. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And yes, just to remind folks, we have a few more minutes on this question. What is a specific example, and it can be a small one, right, that a platform feature that is currently harmful or unsafe that could be addressed by a clear law or even a clear technical standard? If folks have examples of that, I think it could really help ground our conversation. So don't be shy. Anahita can see your hands and can give you the microphone if you'd like to speak, or you can also put your responses in the chat. Lulu, you had your hand up. I think you can go ahead and grab the mic.
Yes. I wanted to come up in this question because a couple of years ago, it's an example from the past, but I think it might be useful. A couple of years ago, the reporting system of attacks online in Twitter required the victim themselves to report the attack. And it was one by one, case by case. So that definitely was a very poor standard in which it was Twitter then, right? It was a very poor standard that required the person under attack to stay in a vulnerable space and themselves had to face, beyond facing the attack, facing the burden of reporting from her own and one by one case. So after a series of conversations with the platform, they understood how challenging that was for the victims and decided to move to a technical solution that made possible for other people to report on behalf of the victim and to do it like with several tweets at once. So that's an example that I think might be suitable for the question.
Absolutely.
We're discussing now.
Yeah, I mean, over my career, I've seen massive changes to these platforms based on direct corporate advocacy from civil society groups, in particular those working on gender-based violence online. And it really has shifted the norms around reporting, absolutely, as well as many other things. Actually, I think loads of credit goes to civil society organizations for changing and in many ways making better and reducing harm on social media platforms. And this is the subject of Luísa's expertise. So I'm so excited to present you, Luísa, to the group. You are going to have the second intervention on how advocacy networks can really translate lived experience via civil society, via coalition building into concrete policy demands and changes at the platform level. So my question to you that prompts your intervention is, civil society is often the first to identify new forms of harm before they are noticed by policymakers. How does your network translate the direct lived experience of survivors into policy language that both tech companies and governments can be effective in response to?
Yes, thank you so much, Mallory, and everyone for being here. I think I can bring an interesting perspective because I have been in a little bit of both sides of this scenario, because I've worked for a long time in government, and now I founded and I'm the executive director of Equilabs, which is a civil society organization that is youth-led and works on digital safety and exactly translating the needs of communities, especially young people, into policy. So I want to answer this question in two layers. I think first a practical layer, which is how lived experience actually makes it into policy and platform decisions in a way that can actually trigger accountability. And second, I think more of a political layer. So who gets believed, what gets labeled as disruptive, and why feminist movements are constantly asked to make themselves, to make ourselves palatable to institutions so that we can have our needs met. Because I think that this whole question on translation, it's not so much about changing the words, of course it is, but it's also about locating power and playing with power a little bit, because a lot of institutions still treat what we call policy language as sort of a tone of voice, as if the issue is that survivors and activists are speaking too emotionally, too loudly, too radically, which woman or gender nonconformative person has not heard that they were being too emotional about something that, of course, is very emotional and tough to talk about and to deal with. So the implicit request then becomes polish your language, soften your critique, sound more neutral, look more professional. So behave like the people who historically had the right to be in these rooms. And the reality is that the ideal stakeholder then has a gender, a race, a geography, a class. And then in practice, what I noticed is that activists like myself and like so many others that I know are expected to behave a little bit like lobbyists, sometimes even to dress like lobbyists, to sound like men, more specifically like European and North American men who have long been treated as sort of the default rational voice in governance spaces. But we all know that survivors don't owe anyone respectability. Feminist movements don't owe anyone politeness. And especially the communities being harmed in real time, they don't owe anyone a rebrand of their pain to make it more palatable or easier to then be translated into policy. So when I say translate, I don't mean sanitizing. We have to translate because institutions have built a language that makes violence harder to hear. And one of the most important insights that civil society brings is this awareness that tech-facilitated gender-based violence is rarely one incident. It's usually a chain reaction. It moves across platforms, across formats and different social networks. So that helps us shift a little bit the language and the discourse from, okay, how can we actually take down this content, which is an important part of it, but towards a conversation that is, what makes escalation so easy and repetition so cheap and amplification almost automatic? And then who benefits from that? Who's profiting off of that? At Equilabs, we're a youth-led digital rights lab, and our work sits right in this translation gap. So between what people are living through and what institutions are able or willing to act on. And I think practically we do this exercise through 3 different ways. I'll say that first, we build kind of a collective signal out of specific experiences. So we work with young people and frontline feminist and queer organizers to map how harm actually travels, especially the moments where the systems fail. So when it comes to reporting or delays or re-upload on certain deep fake AI porn that stayed online. So kind of how this harassment becomes then a method of silencing because of the delays of platforms and of policies. Then we turn that into a pressure that decision makers cannot ignore, which is exactly what Mallory was talking about. The different wins that civil society had was also because we then have to turn this into a sort of issue that is not personal anymore, but becomes public, becomes politicized. Sometimes that looks like a policy input. Sometimes it looks like coordinated public pressure. For example, with Equilabs, we mobilized over 100 young people to demand AI justice at Davos, which is a space that is often treated as a little bit of a big tech playground when it comes to governance. So here, what we wanted to do was to break the feeling that these rooms are untouchable and show that young people, just like other historically oppressed groups, can show up with demands and power and analysis and sort of a say in how these systems work. And then I would say that the third sort of lever of influence that we do is also by teaching people that they are allowed to be political actors in these systems. So a lot of participatory policymaking is outdated and inaccessible. I think most of us know that long consultations, dense language, timelines that assume that you have staff and funding to respond to these surveys and consultations, which will then go to a report, which will then become perhaps policy. So grassroots groups don't even know most times that these processes exist, or they just don't know how to respond in the right format with the right language to be taken seriously. So we do also a lot of capacity building and strategy work so that more young people and community organizations can engage governments and platforms without being neutralized a little bit in this process. And here I want to make a point, which is something that what we notice in our work is that when policy makers struggle to take youth experience seriously, it often reflects what we've noticed, a little bit of a distance in everyday life. So if you don't have young people in your life as equals, if you don't have queer people, if you don't know any person of color, or if you don't have migrant friends or disabled people in your life, it becomes harder to recognize the urgency in your professional life and to understand the shape of harm, because your mental model of the digital world is incomplete. So we also advocate for closing gaps in this more unconventional way as well. And I just wanted to make a part of the last part of my intervention to also talk a little bit about the politics of this translation, because I've heard and I feel like most of the times digital policy is not always, unfortunately, a response to harm. Most of the time is a response to risk, but risk as defined by those least impacted by systemic violence. So when platforms talk about trust and safety, when governments talk about systemic risks, too often the underlying question is, well, is this about reputational risk, market risk, regulatory risk, diplomatic risk? So harm becomes urgent only when it threatens these systems. And I think that at the same time, we see that the ongoing violence against racialized, queer, disabled community then gets treated as isolated incidents if it's not posing a diplomatic risk or regulatory risk. So I would like to encourage everyone to shift from a risk-based approach to a rights-based approach. So how can we actually give people's rights so then we can lower harm and actually protect communities? And that allows us to understand that there is a sort of lack of understanding of the agency behind these systems. So we understand, I think most of us understand, that there is a platform issue. So the platform design is what is also pushing violence. But when we say that AI is generating deepfake porn of women and gender non-conforming people, we also can't forget that it's men using AI to generate deepfake porn of women on platforms owned and governed mostly by men in societies where many laws are still written, analyzed, and voted on mostly by men. So the solutions here are not technical. They have to be societal, they have to be political and organized. So in order to organize our response, in the same way that the far right and the very harmful and violent far right movements that have been harassing women and gender minorities online, we have to also organize our response. This is why resourcing feminist, queer-led, youth-led, global majority-led organizations is the backbone of any accountability system, because civil society is not just one entity. We know that the groups closest to harm are often the least protected and also the least funded. So I think that this is an important conversation on language, because it decides what is taken seriously. And here, the whole topic of this discussion is coalescing for safety. But what this actually has to mean is that we have to create an accountability infrastructure that is sustained by funding, by protection, by access to survivor-led, feminist, queer-led, youth-led organizations, and understand the relationship between power and institutions, and use our own privileges to actually shift this debate. So that's it for now.
Thank you, Luísa. That was really multifaceted, and I think there's a lot that I want to highlight. But one thing you said, so we're again moving into an interactive break. So folks should, queue up questions or their own responses by raising their hands. One thing you mentioned I wanted to talk about is like the work that goes into building capacity in communities so that they can take advantage of the open processes that already exist. So if we're trying to lower barriers to participation beyond just, the status quo, mostly men making these decisions, we can't just leave the door open, right? We know that civil society has a role to help us all walk through those doors, right? To really create the truly inclusive and accessible processes. I noticed that a lot in standards. It's surprising to know that a lot of global standards bodies are actually fairly open in the sense that you can follow the proceedings, you can even attend, participate yourself. But the barrier, of course, is very high when it comes to understanding what those conversations are about and understanding how to influence them, because they're very technical, because they do only think of risk and not a human rights approach. There's a bunch of different things. So just wanting to see if you had any reflections on that. More broadly, other folks can chime in with your experiences more technical spaces, because this is about, tech-specific facilitated gender-based violence. And then in general, just like coordination strategies. I think I at least see regularly these sort of images of the government bringing in tech companies into, of course, like some kind of civil suit or hearing, because that's how we do things in the U.S. It's never through regulation, but just through like the courts. Anyway, they bring them in, and then the survivors are all there. The CEOs have to then face them. It's these really pristine media moments, right? And I wonder, how that looks or works in other parts of the world. Just kind of ginning up ideas for strategies. So I'm not seeing anybody in the chat, although there could be folks having their hands up that I'm not seeing. But yeah, please, I'll pause for a few minutes if there are responses to these ideas. Well, I think we don't want to run down the clock too long for folks who are listening in. We'll keep the conversation moving. But yes, thank you so much, Luísa, for your interventions. I think civil society has a huge role to play, and you have most affected communities on your side. You sort of have like the righteous point of view. It's about, how to get that word out there. Regulation plays a huge role, right? Some of what we've been talking about leads to the work that Lyndsey Scott is doing at Ofcom, I had a colleague who said regularly, regulation is the end game, right? That is what we need. That is the ultimate tech accountability mechanism. So I'm excited to welcome Lyndsey into this conversation because we're going to think about how regulation fits into this system, these systems, plural, of accountability. So I think, Lyndsey, if I'm not wrong, there's recent practical guidance for tech companies on creating, quote, a safer life online for women and girls that Ofcom has put out. And it highlights the importance of platforms going beyond just compliance frameworks. So from your perspective as a regulator, could you explain why simply meeting legal requirements is just not enough to combat tech-facilitated gender-based violence in particular? And, specifically, how does this piece of guidance encourage companies to move from just responding to reports to actually designing, going back to that safety by design concept that keeps coming up, how do they move forward to actually designing safer products from the beginning rather than as an afterthought? Welcome.
Thank you. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and great to hear the thoughts beforehand from speakers and audience. It's been really fascinating so far. So yes, I'm from Ofcom and I'll start by giving a little bit of the context because I know I'm speaking to quite an international audience. So I'm sure that regulation and laws are working slightly differently in online safety spaces. But yes, Ofcom is the UK's online safety regulator. We regulate companies also that run other forms of communications in the UK, such as broadcasting and postal system as well. And yeah, different regulators have different setups in different countries, but we are independent of government in the UK and therefore we don't write the online safety laws. We are responsible for taking those laws and putting them into action. So in the UK, as Marina already mentioned, that law is the Online Safety Act, and that is largely focused on regulating the systems and processes of tech companies and not specific pieces of content online. So yes, the onus is on the tech companies themselves to be responsible for what goes on their sites and the processes that run it. And the Online Safety Act is this focus kind of in two kind of large buckets to really simplify quite a complicated piece of legislation. One on making illegal harms that are already illegal in the UK, such as stalking, intimate image abuse, abusive speech, as illegal and as enforceable online as they are in person. And the second bucket is protecting children online and making sure that children are afforded a higher degree of protection online than they are currently. So yeah, when the Online Safety Act was passed in the UK Parliament in 2023, civil society organisations and VOG or TFGBV organisations campaigned for the bill to include a gendered lens on the online harms that the bill would include. And the response to that by the UK Parliament was adding in a section to the Online Safety Act for Ofcom to produce guidance on the content and activity that disproportionately affects women and girls online. And that's what we did. So as you mentioned, our guidance is called A Safer Life for Women and Girls, and we published that in November of last year. And the guidance is a resource to show platforms that, yes, they need to go beyond compliance if they want to address the really varied harms landscape that women and girls are facing online in an effective way that produces results. So the guidance itself has 9 clear and practical actions for tech companies on how they can make platforms safer for women and girls online and everyone else as well. We want those safety settings to be afforded to everyone. And how we structured it was taking those existing legal duties, so I mentioned in terms of illegal harms and protecting children online, and then what we did is we added extra good practice steps, as we call them, alongside those duties to demonstrate to platforms what practical steps they could take to extend their duties in often quite small but quite impactful ways in order to prevent TFGBV online. So a couple of kind of practical examples of what that looks like within the guidance. Safer default settings. So platforms already have to introduce safer default settings to stop strangers from interaction with children online. And we encourage them to think about other safer default settings from this gendered lens. So removing geolocation as a default would be one of them, so people can't be tracked without knowing. And another example would be on algorithms and algorithmic content and how that's promoted. So platforms already have to exclude misogynistic violence and abuse from children's algorithmic feeds. And we suggested the ways they can extend this by thinking a little bit earlier down the pipeline. So by using nudges and prompts to stop people from posting that misogynistic abuse and violence in the first place, imposing rate limits in pylons so they can stop a flurry of abuse from towards one person, and that can really change the impact that a victim or survivor can have in those situations. And a lot of these are steps that platforms already do, so we know that they're practical and effective, and we're heavily kind of like evidence-based on our examples here. But what we've done is we've just brought all of these steps together in the guidance in a kind of cohesive space to make it as simple as possible to understand where changes are needed. So yeah, those are just a few examples from the guidance, but it shows us kind of a shift in thinking reactively once harm is discovered, and a kind of onus on the victim to always have to report what's happened, to think about safety much earlier along the design process. So I'll stop there. But yeah, I'm also happy to kind of touch on some of the themes that have already come up in terms of how we interacted with civil society, and also how we have to think about this slightly differently because it's a voluntary piece of guidance and it doesn't have the same kind of enforceable duties as some of our other powers.
Thank you for that. And you have actually plenty of time. I wonder if you could elaborate on maybe some of the other things that Ofcom has done in the regulatory landscape beyond guidance like this. Like, are there examples you have of, what does regulatory action look like, I guess, giving folks an overview of how it works in the UK?
Yeah, I can talk about the mandatory duties a little bit, and then maybe touch a little bit on how they kind of overlap with the TFGBV space. So yeah, they're kind of massive pieces of work. So I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. But yeah, an example of what we've done over the summer is to do with protecting children online. So kind of one of our kind of like landmark pieces of work was bringing in age assurance to platforms, and that was interacting with in a lot of industries such as the porn industry that historically have not been interacted with and kind of had a dialogue with a lot of regulators. And the purpose of that the age assurance legislation is to stop younger children from being able to access that content, and that is the kind of doing that, and again bringing in regulation to a space that for let's say 20 to 25 years, in the case of social media that's not had this regulatory, is always going to be a big behavioural change online. But yeah, we've had success in bringing companies into compliance in those areas. And similar for legal harms, some of the legal harms that I mentioned already in terms of ones that overlap with TFGBV in terms of online stalking, coercive control, intimate image abuse, companies have much stronger duties in terms of how victims and survivors are able to report them, how the companies respond to those reports. But yes, it's very much about the systems and processes that underpin how those responses and reports are handled, and how they assess risk proactively on their platform, and how they view how those harms will occur. And yeah, that's, as a regulator, we assess those risk assessments and come in with the evidence where we believe that is not the case, or if it's been assessed in the wrong way.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for sharing more. So everyone, we are ahead of time, which gives us more opportunity to share individual experiences. And we can now take this question as broad as possible, which is, what are the both conventional, maybe even unconventional levers for accountability to the powerful, right? And I would also invite panelists. So, before we were really wanting to get the audience to interact with us, but I think, panelists, you can reflect on what you've heard from your co-panelists. Anyone can jump in the chat, of course, respecting the guidelines as always. And also you can raise your hand to be taken off mute to deliver your intervention. And it'd be great if we could get some storytelling, right? Folks who have used both conventional and unconventional methods, things that you've thought of that you haven't yet been able to implement. Someone noted, I just want to say, Fabiola, if you would like to share yourself, deliver this vocally, I think you're making a really good point, which is that it's rare for there to be enough resources to take big tech companies to in the U.S. court system. Again, it's very much the norm, unofficially in this country, where a lot of these big companies exist to deal with issues through the court system rather than regulation. And it's just very difficult to bring cases in the US. It's not that it hasn't happened, but it takes a lot of resources, I'm sure. So yeah, you can elaborate on that. I know you've shared, you've shared your thoughts. Others, I'm just checking no hands raised as far as I can tell, which is fine. Hi, Mallory.
We do
Can
have
we have
Fabiola.
you? Yes, please go ahead. Hi, welcome.
Hi, my name is Fabiola, and I worked for a public interest organization in DC, and it was a tech justice law project. And we managed to sue some AI companies, character AI, and recently I've been seeing lawsuits against ChatGPT. But I'm back to Africa, back home in Rwanda, and I've been seeing children or women affected by this kind of harms. But even as a lawyer, I cannot afford to sue ChatGPT or all these big tech AI tools. So I wonder if you have other ideas of alternatives. How can we support the women and children that are being affected by these technologies, but without using the litigation, or maybe litigation, but we don't have even the legal frameworks that support those kind of litigation. So I wonder how we can support the victims.
Yeah, genuinely. And maybe just I'll, respond maybe from the US perspective. It does seem there are opportunities for strategic litigation where you have class actions against tech companies. Some of them are happening now, like some of the headline news, if you're reading, where Mark Zuckerberg recently went up to testify. These are, it's a strategic litigation around specific issues related to age verification, related to child safety. Could be that the classes include more folks abroad. I don't know that is always in the toolbox for strategic litigators to imagine including cases from abroad, but it could be, that could be a gap really to highlight.
I have some thoughts on it. I think that one thing that I've been thinking a lot about recently is on how to build movements for accountability. And I come from Brazil, and although we do have a number of laws and regulations when it comes to big tech regulation and platforms and AI, I think that there are also a lot of gaps. And one thing that I noticed when it comes to protecting people is how can we actually mobilize people so that they can even realize that there is harm and that there is an opportunity to denounce this harm through different platforms. When I say platforms, I mean like consultations or interventions or coalitions with other organizations in other countries or within the same country. Or I think that I can't tell what's the case for Rwanda specifically, but I do think that the first thing that anyone can do is support in this movement building activity. So how can we get people to understand that there is oppression happening through AI systems, through social media platforms? How can we get people to actually go and talk to their regulators when it comes to their demands? So all of this cannot be done by one person. Usually it's done by a community that goes together and puts this pressure together. So I think that maybe an avenue is to start mobilizing the community so that can create public pressure, which then can gain traction both nationally and internationally, and working with other civil society organizations that have done similar actions in other countries that have led to results, because I know that there are a few. So maybe movement building is a way forward.
And also the important piece you wanted to highlight that you said is international, cross-border. Marina, not to call you out, but you're a sort of international organization representative here on this panel, and I appreciate that the work you did and that you've talked about spans many countries. You actually do have a wide view. When it comes to accountability, how can we leverage the sort of international NGO system better instead of relying on courts in specific countries or regulations that are only for specific jurisdictions? Do you have any thoughts on the INGOs, including maybe the UN? We can invite some of our organizers maybe to chime in on this. But are there things that you've seen that are opportunities or gaps?
Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really important point. Of course, litigation against large technology companies requires enormous resources. So many countries simply cannot rely on that route alone. So that's why, of course, I go back to the same point, but strong regulatory frameworks that place clear obligation directly on the platforms and monitoring bodies with things like risk assessments and reporting systems and timelines for removing abusive content, that shifts the burden from the individual to the system. But we also need regional cooperation or international cooperation where countries align standards so that platforms face consistent expectations across markets. And that creates some form of soft accountability. Like, no government wants to be the country where online abuse goes unaddressed, and no company wants to operate in a regulatory vacuum that becomes the global outlier. So, and to that, I would agree on the importance of civil society and community reporting mechanisms in documenting that harm and supporting survivors when formal legal routes are limited. So this is why we work on benchmarking these laws to try and identify where the gaps are, but also where some good examples that we are observing are coming forward.
Excellent. Yes, thank you very much. Happy to hear other thoughts still. We have some few minutes before we wrap up. Maybe one thing I'd like to connect a bit is we were talking about just very briefly on technical standards and regulation. I feel like there is some opportunity there for those things to be reinforcing, similarly to how governments and litigation can be reinforcing to civil society action, for photo ops, for good stories getting out there, for direct corporate advocacy in those moments. I don't know, Lyndsey, if you had any thoughts on how the work that gets done in more technical spaces around standardization can leverage or harmonize with the work of regulators, and how those strategies, I guess, can be reinforcing.
Yeah, I think so. To make sure I understand correctly, when we talk about technical standards, are we talking about the kind of like the standardization of processes within technical teams, etc.?
Yeah, I think it kind of can be both, right? Like sometimes it's like this protocol now has these kinds of features, but a lot of it is norm setting as well. Like one example is around authentic content, like images and so on. There's a technical standard for that being developed in ISO, for example. But sometimes it's a little bit, it runs the gamut, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, as someone who used to kind of like work as an engineer and understands how these processes and how the kind of culture is set within technical teams by technical standards and regulation, I absolutely agree. And yes, I think the kind of like the standards setting is really important. And I think one example, kind of slightly tangential, but one that's kind of is a really important example of that in the kind of TFGBV space that we kind of like push for is hash matching as a kind of industry standard way to have digital fingerprints and kind of like watermarking on things like image abuse and also kind of child abuse image areas as well. If this becomes an industry standard and all tech companies start using this and having a collective database where we compare this, that means it has a kind of a collective result at the end of victims not having to re-report images constantly and for them to be taken down at the point of upload. And like that would be a huge effort. So that's something that we're currently consulting on to make a kind of permanent recommendation and a mandatory measure for tech companies. But yes, that's an example of if there was a standardized way that the tech companies did this and this was a kind of a regulatory mandatory measure, then we'd have a really big collective kind of end difference on how victims and survivors experience these harms.
Now, that makes a lot of sense that, it's about making the change once or making the right decision for this technical design once and then expecting that to ripple across, either because there's a normative responsibility, people want to do the right thing, or because there's a regulatory and compliance reason to do so. Well, we've reached the end of the session. I haven't necessarily summarized a lot of the takeaways, but I feel like one way to summarize is also by, vector, right? Like, is this, the vector you're taking with bottom up civil society advocacy strategy? Is it top down through something like regulation or norm building at the international level? I mean, I don't have necessarily anything really crisp for you all, but I just want to appreciate how well-rounded our panel has been and the deep expertise at the same time that has been brought here. And I'm looking forward to wrapping this up and looking at the summary of all that's been said, because I think it really does inspire a lot of renewed action, that we are not powerless, that we really do actually have some levers at our disposal that we can make change and affect these really huge, but not completely invincible tech companies. Anyway, thanks. Back over to you, Lulu. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mallory, Luísa, Lyndsey, Marina. It's been a great keynote to end the day. Thanks everyone for being with us during this day one of the Global Symposium on TFGBV. I just want to come over the words that Marina left us as well during this session about the scale and the speed of TFGBV and the need of agility of our field, which I think we have seen some really exciting examples on how we are facing the challenges. At the same time, we are together making live a momentum in which the concern and the interest to combat TFGBV hasn't been as strong as ever. So I'm really excited as well to see what's coming for the next day of the Global Symposium tomorrow. On behalf of our co-hosts, UNFPA, APC, and the Global Affairs Canada, I would like to thank you all for being here today, for your engagement, your participation, all the links you share, all the thoughts you have shared as well, your live experiences, your sensitivity as well. We are learning together, we are crossing paths together, and we are together as well in the interest of advancing collective action against TFGBV. Remember that the event platform will remain open for the next 30 days, so you can feel free to come back at any time and carry on exploring and connecting with others and the resources that we are sharing there. Have a good rest of the day. We look forward to see you tomorrow for the day 2 of this Global Symposium. Thank you once more, and bye-bye.